Good morning. So, first of all, I think let's give everyone who is organized and volunteering for this conference a massive round of applause, because there is so much work that goes on behind the scenes to organize a conference like this, and the thoughtfulness and the amount of care that has been gone into putting together this conference, I think, is pretty amazing. So hats off to Troy and Glenn and everyone else who's participating in this. So this is me and my business partner, Scott, and we went to high school together, and we became business partners when we reconnected at our 10-year high school reunion. Oops. There's poor UI on this clicker because the escape button is right next to the forward button. So Scott is kind of your stereotypical programmer. When we were at the reunion and people said, "Hey, what do you do?" He goes, "I'm a software developer." People go, "Oh, yeah, I kind of saw that's coming." I am not your stereotypical developer, because while I grew up with technology from a very early age, we had a Macintosh in my house in 1985. We had a T1 running to my house in like 97. So I was very comfortable using technology, but I didn't feel that I was allowed to create technology. They didn't have Goldie Blocks or Hello Ruby when I was growing up. We had Teen Talk Barbie. Yeah, so this was the toy that I got to play with, and a lot of my peers who grew up in the early and mid-'80s. We were told that math class was hard, we were told that shopping was fun, and we were told that if we wanted to be culturally appropriate, we would not go into computers. And this has resulted in a massive deficit that we see today of women in computing, which I think is great that we're getting back to that. So I became your stereotypical marketer, because that's what my teachers pushed me into, that's kind of what the world pushed me into. But Scott had started a company called Corgibytes, and he had been running it for about 18 months when we reconnected at the reunion. And he goes, "You know, I solved this really interesting technology problem, and it turns out nobody wants to buy what I built." And so all of a sudden, he had a marketing problem, and my skills were no longer annoying. They were valuable. And so we really enjoyed working with each other when we were in high school. We're like, all right, let's do this thing. I'll be Jobs, you be Woz, we got this thing. And so I was like, okay, the only thing is that I've got to learn how to code. I can do that. It was a little overwhelming. And I had that Barbie voice in my head constantly saying, coding is hard. You can't do this. Go back to marketing because that's where you belong. And I thought about quitting, but Scott and the community I got most involved with early on was the Ruby community. And I met so many people who would not let me give up. And they said, coding is a skill. What you're experiencing now, everybody has experienced this. It's universal. Like, nobody comes out of the womb knowing how to code. And you can learn it, and I believe in you. So one of the people who I met early on was at my first software conference. His name's Jeff Casimir, and he now runs the Turing School in Colorado. And he gave a talk at that conference about becoming a polyglot programmer, so someone who codes in multiple languages. And I was like, oh, yes, that makes so much sense. So I decided, you know, this is my first software conference. What better way to meet people than to give a lightning talk? So I decided to get up on stage, and I said, here's another language that you can add to your tech stack. English. I gave a talk called Your Code is Awesome, Your Copy Sucks. And it was very well received because people started recognizing that communication is just as important as being able to write the software in a programming language. Because if you can't convince people of your ideas, and especially in open source, if you can't rally a community behind you, what really do you have? So the more that I've explored this idea over the past 6, 7 years, the more I've realized that these days, it used to be that you would go to a company and you would, the first question out of your mouth would be like, are you technical or non-technical, right? And that would always scare me as somebody who's crossing that chasm from the non-technical world. And the answer that I give now, and I hope to encourage all of you, if you ever get asked this question, is that you're both. It is not an either or. We like to think in terms of binary, but these days you have to have both skills. So before we jump in and kind of get into some of the technical details about adding English to your tech stack, let's first take a step back and just analyze and say, okay, what is communication? The first thing to know about communication is that it is rooted in empathy. And before you all check out and go, oh my God, this is a soft skills talk, so I don't have to pay attention, this is super critical. So empathy is a noun. It is not a verb. Empathy is a thing that you acquire after you have listened and truly understood where somebody else is coming from. And this can even be your future self, right? So let's say you're working on a project by yourself, right? Or you're, contributing to an open source project and you know that kind of there's not a whole lot of community around it yet, right? It's being able to take that perspective of what does myself 6 months from now, 5 years from now need? What do the people who are going to be contributing to this project need in order to be successful? And it is a skill. And sometimes it's hard to learn. But it's important to recognize that no one is born out of the womb with empathy, just like no one is born out of the womb knowing how to code. This is a skill that we can learn. So the other thing we can look at about communication is that you can also look at it in terms of events. So you have synchronous and asynchronous events. So synchronous events, this is a synchronous event, right? We are all participating at the same time, right? The people who will be watching this video later, that's an asynchronous event, right? You also have the obvious and not obvious. So, obvious synchronous events, phone calls, if you use Screen Hero, Skype. Asynchronous, you've got Twitter, Slack's kind of in the middle, Stack Overflow. But then you also have non-obvious ones. And this is where I want everyone to really pay attention. So on the synchronous side, you have things like idle chit-chat, right? Let's say you're going to your cousin's wedding, and you're in the buffet line, and somebody says, so what do you do? That's a form of communication. You're selling your company, you're selling your team, you're selling your open source project right there. Because you don't know if that person has a best friend who could be your next awesome contact. Also, eye contact, right? People don't necessarily think about that. Your posture, your body language, whether or not you show up to meetings on time. These are all things that form an impression about you. Next, we have asynchronous events, and this is particularly useful in open source because most events happen asynchronously. Commit messages, right? So how many of y'all have ever run git blame and then realized that afterwards it was yourself, right? So commit messages are a way to, kind of remember what your idea was, what your thinking was. How many of y'all actually use that description part of the commit message rather than, I see maybe a couple of hands. That's an opportunity to document your rationale, document your idea, because it's easier to work with code later when you do that. Naming. Do you just use foo and bar, or do you actually like take the time to think about how you're naming your variables, your classes, your methods? Scenarios, tests, all different forms of communication. Timesheets, this is one of my favorites. Because as a business owner, we send our clients a list of, we pull a report and it's got the timesheets, how much people have worked on it, and then all the comments that they've put in. And that's really, really valuable to our clients. But yet my staff, I have folks, and it's taken them a while to realize that, yeah, that's kind of useful, right? Do you just put 8 hours in, or do you like actually put in what you've worked on that day? Pull request comments, right? So every time we comment on a pull request, that's an opportunity to really talk about what our thinking was, rather than just adding a +1 or a thumbs up, right? Because if you do that, you don't really have a lot of context later. Error messages. Yes. I genuinely feel sometimes that the reason I'm on stage is because I hate poorly written error messages so much. And so it's easier to teach developers how to write them well, as opposed to just dealing with the frustration. So lots of different things here. So the way that I define communication is that it's just an artifact of an idea, right? So it is a thing that expresses your, something that you're trying to do. And so when we define it in that way, it's really not that different than code. So I'm going to talk about legacy code now, because this is what my company specializes in. And legacy code is code that's notoriously difficult to work with. And the reason that it's hard to work with is because there's so little communication artifacts around it. And a lot of times you have to go digging, right? So we get projects where there's no documentation, things are just a mess. And Michael Feathers, who wrote the book Working Effectively with Legacy Code, he defines legacy code as code without tests. And that's kind of polarizing, because then that kind of gets into the whole debate of, do we have to test all of our code? How much test coverage do you need? 100% coverage is really kind of unrealistic. That's approaching an asymptote. So I think one of the things that we can do is expand on his definition and say that legacy code is code without communication artifacts, of which tests are an important one. So the way that I think about it is kind of like this. I think about it like an archaeology project, like, you're kind of going out and looking and trying to get context on kind of an older project that you may not be familiar with. And so if you think about tests, they're kind of like a really important thing that gives you a lot of information. So maybe they're bones, right? So bones are something that's really useful. If archaeologists find that, they can learn a lot about a culture. But there are also things that are useful in defining the entire context and giving archaeologists a lot of insight. So pottery, coins, foundations, buildings, writing. And it is the combination of all of these different types of artifacts that gives people insight into the code base and gives people insight into what the world was like when things were working. So that's kind of how I think about legacy code. So why does any of this matter? 3 reasons. First of all, if you want to level up your career in any sense, communication becomes really important. So if you want to start blogging like Scott's encouraging you to do, you need to learn how to communicate. If you want to become a CTO one day, guess what? You're going to have to learn how to communicate about the strategic part of software, not just the down in the weeds technical part. If we're talking about open source. if you want people to contribute to your open source project, good documentation, handling issues well, like those are the things that get people really interested and build trust in your project. So the next is building trust. And think of trust, again, as kind of artifacts. So there's a great researcher in Houston named Brené Brown. And in her book, Daring Greatly, she gives the metaphor of trust as a marble jar. So her daughter was maybe in like 4th grade, and the teacher had a marble jar, and every time the class like collectively did well, they got a marble in the jar, and when it got to the top, they got a pizza party. Trust works very much the same way. You build trust over time, over a series of small interactions. And those small interactions are the artifacts of your communication. The last thing is that communication is essential if you want to have a culture where you are preventing fires instead of fighting them. So one of the core values at Corgibytes is calm the chaos, right? Because we believe that really good decision making happens when you're rested, when you're calm, when you're using your prefrontal cortex and not that like reptilian part of your brain where you're all stressed out. And the only way that you can achieve that kind of culture is when it is soaked in really good communication. So now you may be asking, okay, I get it, this is important, how do I get there? Well, the nice thing is that similar to software, there are patterns and frameworks that we can look to. So I'm going to go over 3 today. And it's important to note that when we talk about these, it's not an all or nothing thing, again. So in his book, Refactoring to Patterns, Joshua Kiryevsky does a great job talking about how you move slowly from one pattern to another. It's not something that you kind of like, it's not like a light switch, it's more like a dimmer. And that's how I want you guys to think of, and gals, that's how I want y'all to think about these patterns and frameworks. It's something that you're constantly moving towards. So the first one is context switching, all right? How many of y'all like feel this one? Like this is a real thing, and I'm gonna tell you now, marketing folks don't get it. Coming from I was a marketing person, and I would go up to Scott when he was coding, and I would need to get his opinion on something. I would be like, hey Scott, got a minute? And typically I would see him go something like this, where he would become so visibly frustrated that I had asked a question, and I was really confused because I was like, I'm genuinely trying to be courteous. Like, I don't want to bug you if you're busy. And I couldn't understand like why I was consistently getting this reaction. So we rooted ourselves in empathy, right? We both like we did a lot of listening, a lot of understanding, a lot of therapy. And what we ended up coming to was one day Scott said, well, I was like 9 inception layers down. I was like, what? And so we talked about the movie Inception, where the idea here is that there is a dream within a dream within a dream. And in the movie, the more layers down you are, if you come up, you get almost the mental equivalent of the bends, right? Like you get decompression sickness. And there's this great scene in the movie where like the person is realizing that it's a dream, and then the world just starts crumbling around because it's like, and that I think is what happens when we context switch. Because when we have to develop software, we have to keep a mental model within a mental model within a mental model within a mental model. and we have to stay so focused. And so when somebody comes up and says, hey, you got a sec, the mental bandwidth that has to happen is, is a second 5 minutes or 20 minutes? Because it's not just a second, I know that. Do I have to, how much work did it take to get down here? How much work is it gonna take to come back up? And as you're holding all of those ideas in your head and trying to make that judgment call, you watch your mental model slowly crumble, and then you get frustrated because it took you so long to get there. And the context switch is real. So what we decided to do was we use inception layers to gauge how interruptible you are. Because it's a lot easier just to name an inception layer than it is to actually say whether or not you got a sec. So now on Slack, if we need somebody's attention, we say, hey Scott, inception layer. And I know that if it's a 1 or a 2, that he's interruptible. If he comes back as a 7, he knows that I'm interested, and he'll ping me when he comes back to the service. So this is a framework that we've used, but it was rooted in empathy, and it was rooted in getting really, really curious about the other person's perspective. So the next pattern is what I call the shattering glass pattern. And this came from How I Met Your Mother. So the idea here is that you want to be less like Ted and more like Tina. So in the show, Ted, who's one of the main characters, he's an architect, they're talking about bad habits. And Ted has this habit of saying, well, actually. And I can tell you that you all saying, well, actually, annoys marketers just as much as them saying, hey, you got a sec, annoys you. So instead of saying, well, actually, which is rather divisive and doesn't build consensus, you want to be more like Tina Fey. And in her book, she talks about using improv as a way to get people together. So yes, and. So an example of this would be somebody comes and asks for a scope change in the middle of a release cycle. Never happens, right? And so you say, well, actually, we can't do that because, right? And that's pretty divisive. The other person is going to feel put off. You can rephrase that and you can get the same information across by saying, yes, I understand that this is really important to you, and we're in the middle of a sprint. Let's sit down and have a conversation and learn about each other's needs so that we can figure out something that works for both of us. That's how you build consensus. So the last framework is basically how not to sound like a jerk. And this is by Kim Scott, who used to run the AdWords team at Google. And the care personally axis, she calls the give a damn axis. And the challenge directly is the how much am I willing to piss you off axis. And so when you get right in the middle, you have what she calls radical candor. And this is so important. She tells the story of how she was working for Sheryl Sandberg. And Sheryl Sandberg gave her some feedback about her speaking skills because she was using kind of every other word. And the message wasn't quite getting through to her that she really needed to work on her speaking skills. And so she gives this great story about how Sheryl Sandberg challenged her directly and said, when you say the word every other word, it makes you sound stupid. It takes away from the validity of your presentation. And the reason that Sheryl Sandberg could say that was because she had built so much trust on the give a damn axis. So Kim Scott gives a number of different principles about what makes up radical candor. It's based in humility, it's helpful, it's immediate. You give criticism privately, and you give praise publicly, and you don't talk about somebody's character, you talk about the work. So this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg, right? I would implore you to get curious about English and get curious about communication the same way that you learned how to code. Because there is a lot of technical stuff in here. And the biggest thing to remember, if you take nothing else away from this talk, is to remember that communication is a skill. You can learn it, and I believe in you. So just like y'all wouldn't let me give up when I thought I couldn't code, I'm not going to let y'all give up because you don't think you can communicate. So here's a list of books that are really awesome for if you're interested in kind of getting curious about this. I'll pause so people can take pictures for a moment because I see a lot of cameras up. But yeah, all of these are really, really great for learning how to get interested in communication. Everybody got it? Ready to move? Cool. All right, so that about wraps it up. So here's my Twitter. Please reach out to me. I'm really excited when people are interested in learning how to communicate better. We've got a podcast over at legacycode.rocks. If we've got an open source repo, so if you're interested in legacy code, you can contribute there. And then I also blog at Empathy Driven Development. So another thing to add to your list of resources. So thank you all very much, and I'm looking forward to an amazing, amazing conference.